For today's video, we are now looking at the multiplier and combining it with fiscal policy. And for this, we're really looking at sort of the mechanics of how fiscal policy works. So when we look at the multiplier, if you recall from a few videos ago, we talked about it in terms of when the government spends money on something. So, if the government gives money to, the government spends money on a tank. Government buys the tank for $100 because I don't feel like coming up with a number more hard than that. So, government spends $100 on a tank. So that adds $100 to GDP. That $100 eventually ends up in the hands of multiple people who then can choose to spend or save it. For simplicity's sake, we're going to say it all goes to a single person. So the government gives that money, buys the tank from person one. Person one then has $100. They choose to spend or save that money. We're going to say they choose to spend 80% of it. So they will spend, save. So person one spends $80, saves $20. So in that next round, $80 has now been added to GDP. That $80 bounces around the economy and eventually ends up in the hands of a lot of people. And for simplicity's sake, we're going to spend that and say that entire $80 was spent on a single item. They bought a coffee maker. So person one bought a coffee maker from person two for $80. Person two chooses to either spend or save that. Well, they have, for simplicity's sake, we're saying the same marginal propensity to consume. So we are going to say that they have an 80% marginal propensity to consume. So that means they are going to spend $64 and they are going to save $16. That $64 has now been added to GDP. That $64 gets spent on a toy truck that person three has. That person three now has a choice of spending or saving. They spend 80%, which is, we're going to say, $51. And they're going to save 13. That $51 is added to GDP. And you see how this keeps going, because then that $51 is going to be spent on something that goes to somebody else, and they're going to spend or save, and it just keeps adding to GDP. So that original $100 spending keeps getting added at each round. So essentially what this means is you don't have to spend the amount of the gap in your recession to actually change GDP by that much. And it works the same for decreasing as well, as it pulls money out of the economy. So to do that, the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus the MPC, or 1 over MPS if you have the MPS, because 1 minus MPC is the MPS. So here's our first example. If the current output is $500 billion below our potential GDP, and our unemployment is starting to rise, does the government need to inject $500 billion of new government spending into the economy to return us to full employment? And the answer is no. According to the multiplier effect, they do not need to do that, because their initial spending will multiply throughout the economy. So if we now assume our MPC is 0.9, how much would the government need to increase spending by in order to close that recessionary gap? Well, for that, you have to find out your multiplier. The MPC is 0.9. Then the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus the MPC, or 1 over 1/10, or 10. Then you figure 500 billion is the amount of the gap. You divide that by the multiplier to get how much needs to be spent. So 500 billion divided by 10 equals 50 billion. You might be saying, it's called the multiplier. Why did we just divide? Well, because it's the multiplier times the spending equals the gap. That's what is being multiplied. The spending is being multiplied. So we need 50 billion in order to fill that $500 billion gap. Here's a second example. If the government is experiencing an inflationary gap, so we are on the right side of our potential output. Our current output is $800 billion above our potential, and inflation is starting to hurt the economy. Our MPC is 0.75. What is our multiplier? That's sort of our first step. So our multiplier is found by 1 over 1 minus the MPC. So 1 over 0.25 equals 4. You then take the gap, 800 billion, divide it by 4, and you get 200 billion, because 2 times 200 billion equals 800 billion. And that will shift our aggregate demand to the left, that amount. That is government spending. For taxes and transfers, it's going to be a little bit different, because instead of having that first round where the government spent money on the tank, right, and that directly added to GDP, that first round is now gone. Instead, it gives money to people directly, and that they will then choose if they will spend or save it. So what you do is you multiply the multiplier, if you prefer that phrasing, multiply the multiplier by the MPC, because that is how much is being spent in that first round. So the tax multiplier, it's really the tax and transfer multiplier, is MPC over 1 minus the MPC, or MPC over MPS if you have the MPS. So here's an example for that. The government decides to lower income taxes by a lump sum of $1,000. Your MPC is 0.9. How much does this increase the real GDP? So to find that, you need to find the tax and transfer multiplier. So when Americans have $1,000 in their pockets, they'll save $100, 10%, and spend $900, 90%. $900 of new spending will now multiply by a factor of 10, because 1 over 1 minus 0.9 equals 10. So that is using the regular multiplier in order to figure this out. A $1,000 tax cut will multiply into $9,000 of additional real GDP. If you find that out using the tax multiplier, it would be 9/10 over 1/10. So 9/10 times 10 over 1 equals 9. 9 is the multiplier. 9 times 1,000 equals 9,000. I personally prefer to do it that way because it goes a little quicker. If, however, you remember it better by thinking through that initial step of, well, $1,000 in people's pockets means that they will spend 9/10 of it at first, feel free to do that. I prefer the tax and transfer multiplier personally. In example 2, the government decides to increase transfer payments by a lump sum of $500. So same multiplier, $500. Our MPC now is 0.8. How much does the increase in transfer payments increase real GDP? So to do this, you look in the same way. You have MPC is 0.8, so 8/10 divided by 1 minus the MPC, so 2/10. So 8/10 times 10 over 2 8 over 2 equals 4. So our tax and transfer multiplier is 4. So 4 times 500 equals 2,000. That works out the same way if you do it the longer version that I don't prefer. So when Americans receive $500, they'll save 100 and they'll spend 400 because that's their MPC and MPS. And then you can use the regular multiplier. So 1 over 1 minus the MPC, or 5 if you're doing that. So so $400 of that new spending multiplied by 5 will equal $2,000. Like I said, I prefer using the tax and transfer multiplier directly, but you can do it that way as well. How do taxes affect this multiplier? And this is going to be a little bit tricky because the impact of discretionary fiscal policy, and by that I mean an attempt to manage the economy through fiscal policy, is lessened by our progressive tax system. In other words, as you make more money, you will be taxed at a higher rate. So what this means is as people find higher paying jobs, they're going to be actually taxed more, which will therefore actually cause their disposable income to fall. This is going to slow the multiplier process. So the multiplier is not necessarily going to play out the way Keynesians would hope due to our progressive tax system. And this is what we'll term an automatic stabilizer. So automatic stabilizers are government spending and taxation rules that's going to cause our economy to sort of auto-correct. And that's why it's an automatic stabilizer. So the progressive tax policy that I just discussed, that will be an automatic stabilizer. Government transfers frequently are automatic stabilizers because they don't require any new legislation to be passed. If we're in a recession and people are going on unemployment benefits, well, that is automatically increasing government transfers, which is already going to have an expansionary fiscal policy built in there. So that's the idea between about automatic stabilizers. Now, this is all to sort of counteract different types of inflations or recessions. So we're going to go into two types of inflation terminology that you have to know. So cost push inflation is inflation caused by a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. So in other words, it's another terminology for stagflation. So short-run aggregate supply shifts to the left. That is cost push inflation. Demand pull is the other one. It is inflation caused by an increase in demand. So generally speaking, when there is expansionary policy, it's going to cause some amount of demand pull inflation. The other type of taxes that you have to know a bit about are business taxes. So a reduction in your business taxes is going to increase your short-run aggregate supply. And this is another one of those things that is sort of an assumption of the AP test, and in some cases the economic world, that doesn't always necessarily work in real life. The assumption here is a decrease in business taxes will increase investment spending, which will increase short-run aggregate supply and hopefully long-run aggregate supply. Now that would also, if you're fully paying attention, also increase aggregate demand, as investment spending is a part of aggregate demand. So a decrease in business taxes would kind of shift the entire ADAS model to the right. At least that's the goal. And once again, it doesn't always work out that way. But generally speaking, if you see it on the AP test, you should assume that that is what they're getting at. And that is it for this unit.